Old money never buys a car to be noticed. Here are the 10 British cars they actually drove. Stick around, because number 1 will change how you see luxury forever. Subscribe now, because this channel breaks down old money secrets every single week. There's a difference between a car that looks expensive and a car that is old money. New money buys the badge that shouts the loudest. Old money buys the car nobody outside the right postcode would even recognize. Dull paint, no chrome flash, an engine note so quiet you'd think it was ashamed of itself. It's not about horsepower. It's about heritage. A car passed from father to son. A car that sat in the drive of a Georgian manor house for 30 years, mud-splashed from the shooting estate, dog hair on the back seat, and worth more in provenance than in performance. This is the paradox of British old money and the automobile. The families who could have bought anything, the landed gentry, the aristocracy, the quietly wealthy industrialists who never needed to prove a thing, didn't chase novelty. They chased permanence. A car, to them, was closer to a piece of furniture than a status symbol. It was inherited. It was maintained by the same garage in the village for 2 generations. It smelled of leather, wet Labrador, and pipe tobacco. So today we're going deep into 10 British cars that actually sat in the driveways of the aristocracy, the landed gentry, and the establishment families who never had to try. Not the cars featured in rap videos, not the cars bought by lottery winners. The cars old money actually drove, to church on Sunday, to the races at Ascot, to the shoot in November, and quietly, unassumingly into the history books. Let's get into it. The Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. If there is one car that defines the phrase old money, it's the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. Produced between 1955 and 1966, the Silver Cloud wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. This was the car that quietly ferried dukes, earls, and captains of industry between London townhouses and country estates without a single wasted gesture of ostentation. What made the Silver Cloud the definitive establishment car wasn't raw power, though its 6.2-liter 5.8 introduced in 1959 was no slouch for the era. It was the sheer silence of the thing. Rolls-Royce engineers famously obsessed over noise, vibration, and harshness decades before that became an industry buzzword. The joke inside the company was that at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in the cabin came from the dashboard clock. That silence was itself a form of wealth signaling, the ability to glide through the world without disturbance, without friction, without having to raise your voice. Old money families didn't buy the Silver Cloud to be seen. They bought it because it did exactly what was asked of it and nothing more. It picked you up from the station. It carried the family to weddings and funerals. It sat patiently outside the opera while the chauffeur read the newspaper. Many aristocratic households kept a Silver Cloud for decades, servicing it religiously rather than trading it in, because replacing it felt almost disloyal. There are still Silver Clouds in British stately homes today, inherited alongside the paintings and the silver, driven perhaps twice a year, insured for a fortune, adored beyond reason. The color mattered too. You'll rarely find an old money Silver Cloud in anything but a muted, almost apologetic palette: shell gray, sage green, black. Bright colors were for people trying to prove something. The Silver Cloud didn't need to prove anything. It simply was. The Bentley S3 Continental. If the Rolls-Royce was for being driven, the Bentley was for driving. This distinction mattered enormously to old money families, many of whom actually preferred Bentleys precisely because a Rolls-Royce could feel like an announcement, while a Bentley felt like a decision. The Bentley S3 Continental, built in the early 1960s on essentially the same chassis as the Silver Cloud, was the enthusiast's version of British luxury. Faster, sportier, subtly restyled with a sharper front end, the S3 Continental was the car for the landed gentleman who still wanted to feel the road, who wanted something with a bit of temperament, a bit of growl, without ever tipping into vulgarity. This was the car you'd see parked outside a country pub after a day's shooting, still warm from the drive down from London, mud on the wheel arches, a shotgun case visible through the rear window. Coach builders like Mulliner Park Ward and H.J. Mulliner built bespoke bodies for many S3 Continentals, meaning no two were quite identical, each one tailored quite literally to its owner's taste, much like a Savile Row suit. That bespoke element mattered enormously to old money sensibilities. The car wasn't bought off a lot, it was commissioned. Winston Churchill drove Bentleys. So did generations of the British racing and hunting set, who saw the Mark as slightly less stuffy than Rolls-Royce, slightly more willing to get its hands dirty. The Bentley badge, the winged B, became shorthand within a certain social circle for someone who had money but also had taste, someone who understood that the loudest car in the room is rarely the most respected. The Jaguar Mark II. Not every old money car cost a fortune, and the Jaguar Mark II is the perfect example of aristocratic pragmatism. Launched in 1959, the Mark II was, by the standards of the landed classes, almost egalitarian. A car a younger son, a country solicitor, or a retired colonel could afford, while still carrying genuine performance credentials. The Mark II became something of a split personality within British society. On one hand, it was famously the getaway car of choice for London gangsters in the 1960s, thanks to its startling pace. The 3.8-liter version could outrun most police cars of the era. On the other hand, it was equally beloved by the county set, who appreciated its walnut dashboard, its leather seats, and its genuinely thrilling performance wrapped in a shape that never looked anything less than dignified. For old money, the appeal of the Mark II was that it didn't try to be a Rolls-Royce. It was the second car, or the car for the younger generation, the one you gave your son when he went up to Oxford, or the one a countryside doctor drove between house calls. It had presence without pomposity. Parked outside a hunt breakfast or a point-to-point race meeting, a well-kept Mark II in British racing green with wire wheels said exactly the right thing. Money, yes, but restrained. Sporting money, not showy money. Jaguar's own advertising at the time leaned into this duality: grace, space, pace, and it's precisely that combination that made the Mark II a fixture of both the aristocratic weekend and the criminal underworld, often within the very same postcode. The Aston Martin DB5. No list of British old money cars is complete without an Aston Martin, and the DB5 remains the most iconic of them all, though its old money credentials existed well before James Bond ever got behind the wheel. Produced from 1963 to 1965, the DB5 was hand-built in tiny numbers, fewer than 900 were ever made, which instantly made it a rarity item among a social class that valued scarcity above almost anything else. This wasn't a car you simply bought. You often had to know someone or wait, or already be the kind of person Aston Martin wanted associated with the brand. Old money families who owned DB5s tended to be a specific type, landed but modern-minded, often with connections to motorsport, aviation, or the military. Families for whom speed itself was a kind of inherited pleasure rather than a new indulgence. The DB5's straight-six engine, its Superleggera aluminum body built by Touring of Milan, and its extraordinary refinement for a car so fast made it the choice of the aristocratic playboy generation, the sort of young men who'd inherited the family estate but preferred spending afternoons at Goodwood to sitting in the House of Lords. Interestingly, the DB5's later Bond association only reinforced what old money already understood, that this was a car built for a certain kind of Englishman, composed, dangerous when necessary, devastatingly well-dressed, and never, ever flustered. Original DB5s that remained in single-family ownership for decades are now among the most sought-after and expensive classic cars in the world, precisely because that unbroken chain of ownership tells a story money alone can't buy. The Range Rover Classic. It might seem strange to include what began in 1970 as a rugged all-terrain vehicle alongside Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, but the original Range Rover, now referred to as the Range Rover Classic, became one of the truest old money vehicles Britain ever produced, and remains so today. The genius of the Range Rover was that it solved a real problem for the landed classes. How do you get across a muddy field, ford a stream, tow a horse box, and still arrive looking respectable enough to have lunch at the big house? Land Rovers had done the utilitarian job for decades, but they were agricultural, genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely crude. The Range Rover, by contrast, offered real comfort, a smooth V8 engine, and enough interior refinement that you could drive it to the shoot in the morning and to a dinner party in the evening without changing vehicles. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the Range Rover had become the unofficial uniform of the British countryside gentry, parked outside every stately home, every hunt meet, every county fair. Its enduring appeal to old money lay precisely in its lack of pretension. It was, after all, originally conceived as a farm vehicle. There's a particular species of English aristocrat who takes genuine pride in driving a battered, mud-caked, decade-old Range Rover with a dented door and a dog cage in the back, precisely because it signals that they don't need to impress anyone. The scruffier the Range Rover, in certain circles, the older the money. The late Queen herself was frequently photographed driving Range Rovers around the Sandringham and Balmoral estates, cementing its status not merely as a luxury vehicle, but as something closer to a national institution of the landed classes. The Daimler DS4 2.0 Limousine. While Rolls-Royce and Bentley get most of the attention, Daimler occupied a curious and specific niche in the British class system, a mark with even deeper royal associations, having supplied cars to the British monarchy since the Victorian era, long before Rolls-Royce existed. The Daimler DS4 2.0, produced from 1968 well into the 1990s, was the limousine of choice for occasions requiring maximum formality: weddings, state functions, funerals, mayoral processions, and the transportation of visiting dignitaries. Built on a stretched Jaguar platform, but finished with Daimler's own distinct fluted grille and considerably more presence, the DS4 2.0 was less a car for daily driving and more a ceremonial object, the sort of vehicle a titled family might keep specifically for the occasions when appearances mattered most. What's fascinating about the Daimler's old money appeal is how institutional it became. Undertakers, town councils, and the royal family all used the DS4 2.0. It became, in effect, the default British vehicle of solemn occasion. Old money families with a genuine sense of civic duty, the kind who sat as magistrates, served as Lord Lieutenants, or chaired local charities, often kept a Daimler specifically for these public duties, distinct from the more personal Bentley or Jaguar used for everyday life. It was a car that understood its job was not to be enjoyed, but to be correct, and in a society still deeply attentive to correctness, that mattered enormously. The Rover P5B, before Range Rovers took over the countryside, and before Jaguars became the default executive saloon, the Rover P5, and particularly the later V8-engined P5B, was the quiet favorite of the British establishment, so much so that it earned the nickname the Auntie Rover for its slightly staid, sensible, unshowy character. Produced from 1958 to 1973, the P5 was famously the personal car of choice for Queen Elizabeth II for decades, alongside a host of cabinet ministers, bishops, and senior civil servants. There is a particular strand of old money that isn't landed gentry at all, but rather the professional establishment. The judges, the senior clergy, the Oxbridge dons, the permanent secretaries of Whitehall departments, and for this group, the Rover P5B was very nearly the uniform car. Its appeal lay in its understatement. The P5B was comfortable, well-built, genuinely fast once the Buick-derived V8 was fitted in 1967, but it never once looked like it was trying to impress anyone. Sitting low and wide with a coach-built feel to its doors and dashboard, it had a solidity that felt almost ecclesiastical. It was, in the truest sense, a car for people whose status didn't need advertising because everyone in the room already knew exactly who they were. Margaret Thatcher retained a Rover in Downing Street's fleet for years after other politicians had moved to Jaguars, partly as a nod to this exact sensibility. The P5B as the sound, sober, patriotic choice, entirely free of flash. The Alvis TE21. Alvis is a name that's mostly vanished from public memory, and that obscurity is, in a strange way, exactly the point. Alvis cars were built in small numbers throughout the mid-20th century for a very specific slice of British society. Old military families, landed gentry with a taste for engineering rather than ostentation, and a certain species of English eccentric who preferred obscurity to fame. The Alvis TE21, produced in the early 1960s, was a hand-finished grand tourer, often bodied by Park Ward, offering performance and craftsmanship comparable to an Aston Martin or Bentley, but at a fraction of the public recognition. This was, in essence, the ultimate insider's car, the vehicle you bought specifically because almost nobody outside a narrow social circle would recognize the badge, let alone know what it signified. For families with genuinely old money, money going back centuries rather than decades, this kind of obscurity was itself the highest form of status. Anyone can buy a Rolls-Royce if they have the money. Owning an Alvis required knowing the mark existed in the first place, which meant belonging to a world where such knowledge was simply passed down, generation to generation, along with the family silver and the shooting rights. Alvis ceased car production in 1967, and today surviving examples are treasured precisely because so few people, even car enthusiasts, know what they're looking at. The Lagonda. Lagonda occupies one of the strangest and most fascinating corners of British automotive history, a mark that, under the ownership of Aston Martin, produced cars for a genuinely rarefied clientele throughout the mid-20th century. Cars built not for the merely wealthy, but for those whose wealth came bundled with genuine social position. The pre-war and immediate post-war Lagondas, particularly those styled with input from designer W.O. Bentley himself after he left his own namesake company, were extraordinary machines. 6-cylinder engines of enormous refinement, coachwork commissioned individually, and a level of exclusivity that made even Rolls-Royce ownership look almost pedestrian by comparison. Lagondas were the choice of a certain aristocratic set who valued engineering pedigree above brand recognition. People who knew that W.O. Bentley considered his Lagonda work, not his earlier Bentley cars, to be his finest engineering achievement. By the 1970s and 80s, Aston Martin revived the Lagonda name for a radically futuristic, wedge-shaped saloon that became, bizarrely, a favorite of Middle Eastern royalty as much as British aristocracy. But the earlier Lagondas remain the true old money artifact. These were cars kept in family collections, driven at vintage rallies, discussed in hushed, reverent tones at classic car clubs, where membership itself functions as a marker of inherited status. To own a pre-war Lagonda today is to own a piece of a Britain that, in truth, barely exists anymore. An England of house parties, hunting weekends, and a social order so settled it never needed to explain itself. The Morris Minor Traveller. It might seem almost perverse to end this list with a modest wood-framed estate car that most people associate with village vicars and eccentric spinsters rather than dukes and earls. But the Morris Minor Traveller earns its place precisely because it illustrates something crucial about genuine old money that the other 9 cars, for all their grandeur, can only hint at. True old money, the kind that goes back generations, often has a deeply ingrained suspicion of extravagance. Many aristocratic families, having inherited houses that cost fortunes simply to heat, developed a fierce, almost moral commitment to practicality in smaller matters, and the humble Morris Minor Traveller, with its distinctive ash-wood framing and utterly unpretentious character, became the unlikely second or third car of choice for exactly this sensibility. You'd find a battered Morris Minor Traveller parked beside the Bentley in the drive of many a stately home, used for trips to the village shop, for ferrying garden produce, for the estate gardener's errands, or simply because the lady of the house had grown fond of it decades earlier and saw no earthly reason to replace a car that still ran perfectly well. This is, in many ways, the truest expression of old money values, the willingness to drive something modest, even slightly shabby, purely because status was never really about the car in the first place. It was about not needing the car to say anything at all. Looking back across these 10 cars, The hushed dignity of the Silver Cloud, the sporting confidence of the Bentley Continental, the criminal chic duality of the Jaguar Mark II, the cinematic cool of the Aston Martin DB5, the mud-splattered practicality of the Range Rover, the ceremonial gravity of the Daimler, the understated authority of the Rover P5B, the insider's obscurity of the Alvis, the engineering pedigree of the Lagonda, and finally, the almost defiant modesty of the Morris Minor Traveler. A pattern starts to emerge. Old money never really cared about the car as an object of desire. It cared about permanence, about craftsmanship, about things that were built to last generations rather than to impress for a season. The families who actually inherited titles, land, and history didn't need their cars to tell the world who they were. Their names, their houses, their history did that work already. The car was simply a tool, sometimes an exquisitely engineered one, occasionally a genuinely thrilling one, but never, ever the point. And perhaps that's the real lesson buried in this list. In a world increasingly obsessed with visible wealth, with badges, with horsepower figures, with cars as billboards for personal success, the old money approach feels almost radical in its restraint. Buy something well-made, keep it for decades, let it age, pass it down, never explain yourself. That's not a car-buying philosophy, that's a way of life. If you enjoyed this deep dive into British automotive heritage, let me know in the comments which of these 10 cars you'd most want parked in your own driveway. And subscribe for more explorations into the world of old money, old houses, and the quietly extraordinary objects that built the myth of the English aristocracy.